The fire had long since died in the hearth, leaving only ash and the bitter memory of warmth. Alara Whitmore knelt on the cold stone floor of the servants' quarters, her knees pressed against the unforgiving surface until they ached, her fingers raw from scrubbing the same spot over and over again. The water in her bucket had turned gray hours ago, but she dared not ask for fresh water. Asking meant speaking, and speaking meant being noticed, and being noticed by the wrong person in Blackridge Castle could mean a beating, or worse, dismissal into the frozen streets beyond the walls where winter claimed the unwanted like a hungry wolf. She was 24 years old, though she felt ancient in her bones. The other maids whispered that she looked older than her years, that hardship had carved lines into her face that shouldn't exist on someone so young. Alara didn't argue. She had learned long ago that arguing changed nothing. The world was what it was, cruel to those without name, without family, without coin. She had none of these things. What she had were hands that could work, a back that could bend, and a silence that kept her alive. The memory of her mother's face had faded into something soft and indistinct, like a dream half remembered upon waking. Alara had been 7 when the fever took her mother, leaving her alone in a one-room hovel on the outer edge of the slums. Her father had never been part of the picture, a nameless soldier who had passed through the village one spring and left behind only a child he would never know. Her mother had told her once, in a rare moment of tenderness, that her father had kind eyes. Alara clung to that detail as if it were a treasure, though she knew it was likely a lie meant to comfort a curious child. After her mother died, Alara had survived the only way an orphaned girl could, by making herself useful. She cleaned stables for scraps of bread. She hauled water from the well for a copper coin. She learned to mend clothes, to gut fish, to disappear into the background when men with hard faces and harder fists came looking for easy prey. By the time she was 14, her reputation as a tireless, silent worker had reached the ears of the castle's head housekeeper, a severe woman named Matron Grenfell, who hired Alara on the condition that she never speak unless spoken to, never look anyone of rank in the eye, and never, ever expect kindness. Alara had kept that bargain for 10 years. The castle was a fortress of black stone that loomed over the northern realm of Valenmore like a watchful predator. Its towers pierced the sky, crowned with iron spikes and the tattered banners of the wolf clans. Inside, the halls were lit by torches that cast long, dancing shadows, and the air always carried the scent of smoke, damp stone, and something faintly metallic that Alara had come to associate with power. The nobles who walked those halls moved with the confidence of people who had never known hunger, never felt the bite of cold that seeped through threadbare clothing, never wondered if they would survive another winter. Alara envied them and despised them in equal measure, though she would never have dared say so aloud. She lived in a narrow room in the servants' wing, a space barely large enough for a straw mattress and a wooden chest that held her 2 spare dresses and a comb with missing teeth. She shared the room with 3 other maids, all of whom treated her with the same indifference the nobles showed their furniture. Alara didn't mind. Indifference was safer than cruelty, and she had known plenty of cruelty. The worst of it had come from Beta Corwin, the king's chief advisor, a man whose thin lips and pale eyes reminded Alara of a corpse. Corwin had a particular disdain for the lower staff, viewing them as necessary vermin that cluttered his pristine castle. He had struck Alara once, years ago, for failing to bow deeply enough when he passed in the corridor. The blow had split her lip and sent her sprawling against the wall. When she had looked up, Matron Grenfell had been standing nearby, watching. The matron had done nothing. No one had done anything. Alara had learned then that justice was a luxury afforded only to those who mattered, and she did not matter. She had also learned to make herself invisible. Now, as she scrubbed the floor of the great hall in preparation for the Mooncrest Ball, Alara kept her head down and her thoughts carefully blank. The ball was the talk of the castle, a grand spectacle that happened once in a generation. 100 noble princesses from across the realm and beyond had been invited to attend, each one a potential bride for King Alaric Thorne, the Alpha King of the Wolf Clans. The event was steeped in tradition and ceremony, a display of power and politics wrapped in silk gowns and false smiles. Alara had seen the princesses arriving over the past week, each one more dazzling than the last. They traveled in gilded carriages, attended by servants in fine livery, their laughter ringing through the courtyard like music. They wore jewels that caught the light and gowns that shimmered like water. They were everything Alara was not: beautiful, confident, untouchable. She tried not to think about them too much. Thinking led to bitterness, and bitterness was a poison she couldn't afford. The Great Hall was a cavernous space with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that depicted the history of the wolf clans in vibrant, violent color. Long tables lined the walls, each one draped in black and silver cloth, the colors of House Thorn. At the far end of the hall stood the throne, a massive chair carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface polished to a mirror shine. Alara had cleaned that throne countless times, her reflection distorted in its dark surface, a reminder of how small and insignificant she truly was. Tonight, the hall would be filled with light and music, with nobles and royalty, with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. The king would sit upon his throne, and the princesses would parade before him, each one hoping to catch his eye, to secure the bond that would make her queen. Alara would be there too, of course, but only in the shadows, refilling goblets and clearing plates, invisible as always. She didn't know why the thought made her chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to longing. Alaric Thorne was a figure of legend in Valenmore, a man whose very name carried weight. He had ascended to the throne at 18, following the sudden death of his father in a skirmish with a rival clan. The transition had been brutal, a trial by fire that had forged him into the leader he was today. Strong, decisive, and utterly alone. Alara had never spoken to the king, had never even been in the same room as him except when she was part of the faceless staff attending some grand event. But she had seen him from a distance, had watched the way he moved through the castle with the grace of a predator and the weariness of a man carrying a burden too heavy to name. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost cruel, as if beauty had been weaponized. His features were sharp, all hard lines and angles, softened only slightly by the dark hair that fell across his brow and the faint shadow of stubble that marked his jaw. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and turbulent, and they held a coldness that made even the bravest nobles hesitate before approaching him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his body honed by years of training and battle, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous he was. But it was the loneliness in his gaze that had caught Alara's attention, the moments when he thought no one was watching and the mask slipped, revealing something raw and aching beneath. She had seen it once, late at night, when she had been tasked with delivering fresh linens to the king's chambers. He had been standing by the window, his back to the door, staring out at the moonlit courtyard. The way he had stood, shoulders slightly hunched, hands braced against the stone sill, had made him look less like a king and more like a man trapped in a cage of his own making. Alara had left the linens and fled before he could turn around, but the image had stayed with her, a secret she carried like a stolen treasure. The day of the Mooncrest Ball dawned cold and clear, the sky a pale blue that promised no warmth. Alara woke before sunrise, as she always did, and dressed quickly in her plain gray servant's dress, the fabric worn thin in places but clean. She braided her dark hair and pinned it tightly against her head, ensuring that no stray strands would fall and draw attention. She splashed cold water on her face from the basin in the corner, the shock of it helping to chase away the lingering fog of sleep. The castle was already alive with activity. Servants rushed through the corridors, their arms laden with flowers and fabric, their voices a constant hum of urgency. The head cook was shouting orders in the kitchen, the scent of baking bread and roasting meat filling the air. Musicians were setting up in the great hall, tuning their instruments with careful precision. Everyone had a task, a role to play in the grand performance that would unfold tonight. Ilara's role was simple. She was to assist with the final preparations in the great hall, ensure that every surface gleamed, every candle was lit, every goblet was filled, and then, during the ball itself, she was to remain in the background, ready to attend to any need that arose, silent and efficient as always. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of polishing and arranging. Matron Grenfeld swept through periodically, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail, her voice barking corrections and criticisms. Alara bore it all without complaint, her expression carefully neutral. It was only when the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows, that Alara allowed herself a moment to pause. She stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by beauty and opulence, and felt the full weight of her own insignificance pressing down on her. Tonight, the hall would be filled with people who mattered, people whose lives held meaning and purpose, and she would be there too, a ghost among the living, unseen and unheard. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had accepted her place in the world long ago. But as the first strains of music began to drift through the air, as the sound of laughter and conversation grew louder, Alara felt something sharp and painful twist in her chest, something she refused to name. The princesses began to arrive as the last light of day faded from the sky. They entered the great hall in a procession of color and light, each one more stunning than the last. Their gowns were works of art, crafted from silk and velvet, adorned with embroidery and jewels that sparkled in the candlelight. They wore their hair in elaborate styles, crowned with flowers or delicate tiaras. They moved with the grace of women who had been trained since birth to command attention, to captivate and charm. Alara watched from her place near the wall, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze carefully lowered. She could hear the murmurs of admiration, the whispered speculation about which princess would win the king's favor. Names were mentioned, titles recited, alliances discussed. It was all a game, Alara realized, a carefully orchestrated dance of power and politics. The princesses were players, and the king was the prize. And then the king himself entered the hall. The room fell silent, every eye turning toward the dais where King Alaric Thorne stood, framed by the obsidian throne behind him. He was dressed in black, his tunic embroidered with silver wolves that seemed to move in the flickering light. A heavy cloak hung from his shoulders, fastened with a brooch in the shape of a snarling wolf's head. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes scanning the room with a detachment that bordered on boredom. He looked every inch the Alpha King, powerful and untouchable, a man forged in fire and tempered by duty. But Alara, who had learned to see beyond the surface, noticed the tightness around his mouth, the faint tension in his shoulders. He didn't want to be here, she realized. This grand spectacle, this parade of potential brides, was a burden he bore because he had no choice. The thought shouldn't have comforted her, but it did. The ball began in earnest, the music swelling to fill the hall as the princesses took their places, each one waiting for the chance to dance with the king. Alaric descended from the dais, his movements deliberate and controlled, and approached the first princess, a woman with golden hair and a gown of emerald green. She curtsied deeply, her smile radiant, her eyes bright with ambition. Alaric offered his hand and led her to the center of the floor. They danced, and the room watched, entranced. The princess moved with practiced elegance, her every gesture calculated to charm. But Alaric's expression remained distant, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if he were already thinking of something else. One by one, the princesses took their turn. They laughed and flirted. They displayed their accomplishments and their beauty. They did everything they could to capture the king's attention. And one by one, Alaric danced with them, his movements flawless, his demeanor polite but cold. He spoke little, smiled less, and betrayed no hint of interest. Alara should have been working, should have been refilling goblets and clearing plates, but she found herself unable to look away. There was something mesmerizing about the scene unfolding before her, something tragic in the way the king moved through the motions of a ritual he clearly despised. She wondered what it must be like to be surrounded by so many people and still feel utterly alone. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, Alaric's gaze lifted and met hers across the crowded hall. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The music faded, the voices dimmed, and there was only the weight of his stare, piercing and inescapable. Alara froze, her breath catching in her throat. her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. She should have looked away, should have dropped her gaze and disappeared into the background as she had been trained to do. But she couldn't. Something in his eyes held her captive, something raw and searching that made her feel as if he could see straight through her, past the plain dress and the calloused hands, to the person she kept hidden even from herself. And then the moment shattered. The music swelled. The princess in his arms said something that required a response, and Alaric looked away. Alara exhaled shakily, her hands trembling as she turned and hurried toward the servants' entrance, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of whatever had just passed between them. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a coincidence, a meaningless moment that would be forgotten by morning. But as she stood in the dim corridor beyond the great hall, her back pressed against the cold stone wall, Alara knew she was lying to herself. Something had shifted, something had begun, and she had no idea what it would cost her. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating. Alara moved through her duties mechanically, refilling wine goblets and carrying trays of delicacies she would never taste. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying that single moment when the king's eyes had found hers across the crowded hall. She told herself to forget it, to bury it beneath the weight of more pressing concerns like survival and keeping her position. But the memory clung to her like smoke, impossible to dispel. The great hall remained alive with music and laughter, the princesses taking turns dancing with King Alaric, each one more determined than the last to leave an impression. Alara caught glimpses of them as she worked. A princess in sapphire blue who whispered something in the king's ear that made his jaw tighten. Another, in crimson silk, who pressed herself closer than propriety allowed. A third with silver hair who gazed up at him with eyes full of calculated adoration. They were all playing the same game, fighting for the same prize, and Alaric endured them with the patience of a man long accustomed to suffering. Matron Grenfeld appeared at Alara's elbow without warning, her bony fingers closing around Alara's wrist hard enough to bruise. "You're needed in the eastern corridor," the matron hissed, her breath sour with wine. "Princess Marceline has requested fresh water and towels in her chambers. Go, now, and do not dawdle." Alara nodded quickly, grateful for any excuse to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the hall. She gathered the requested items from the linen closet and made her way through the winding corridors of the castle, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone. The eastern wing housed the guest chambers where the visiting princesses were staying, each room more lavish than anything Alara had ever seen. Tapestries hung on the walls, thick carpets covered the floors, and carved furniture gleamed with polish. It was a different world, one that existed in the same castle but might as well have been on another plane of existence. She found Princess Marceline's chamber and knocked softly. When no answer came, she pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. The room was empty, the princess still at the ball, and Alara moved quickly to set down the water basin and fresh towels. She was turning to leave when she heard voices in the corridor outside, sharp and angry. "Absolutely unacceptable," a woman's voice said, dripping with venom. "Did you see the way he looked at her?" "Who?" another voice asked, younger and uncertain. "That servant girl, the mousy one with the dark hair." During the third dance, his eyes wandered to where she was standing. "I saw it clearly." Alara's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, barely breathing, praying they would pass by. "You're imagining things," the younger voice said dismissively. "Why would the king waste even a glance on someone like that?" "I know what I saw," the first voice insisted. "And if I saw it, others did too. This cannot be allowed to continue. The king must choose from among us, not from the refuse that scrubs his floors. What do you propose we do about it?" the younger voice asked, now tinged with something darker, something eager. There was a pause, and then the first voice spoke again, lower now, conspiratorial. "We ensure she knows her place. Accidents happen in castles this old. A fall down the stairs, a scalding in the kitchens, a dismissal for theft. There are many ways to remove an inconvenience." The voices faded as the princesses moved on, their footsteps receding down the corridor. Alara remained frozen against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She hadn't imagined it. The king had looked at her. And now, because of that single moment, she had become a target. Fear coiled in her stomach like a living thing, cold and serpentine. She knew the power these women held, the influence they could wield with a word or a whisper. They could destroy her without lifting a finger, and no one would question it. She was nothing, no one. Expendable. The only rational response was to make herself even more invisible, to avoid the king at all costs, to pray that the princesses forgot about her once the ball ended and their attention shifted elsewhere. But even as she thought this, even as she recognized the danger, a small, stubborn part of her rebelled. Why should she be punished for something she hadn't asked for, hadn't encouraged? She had simply been doing her job. The king had looked at her, yes, but she hadn't looked back. Except she had. And that was the problem. Alara slipped out of the chamber and made her way back toward the servants' wing, taking the longest route possible to avoid crossing paths with anyone important. The castle felt different now, menacing in ways it hadn't been before. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every footstep behind her a potential attacker. By the time she reached her small room, she was shaking. The other maids were still at work, so she had the space to herself. She sank onto her straw mattress and buried her face in her hands, trying to steady her breathing. This was ridiculous. She was being paranoid. The princesses had probably forgotten about her already. Their focus returned to the more important matter of winning the king's favor. Tomorrow, everything would go back to normal. She would clean and serve and disappear into the background. And this night would become nothing more than a strange, unsettling memory. But sleep, when it finally came, brought no comfort. Her dreams were filled with gray eyes and whispered threats, with hands reaching for her in the dark and voices that promised pain. She woke before dawn, as always, and dressed quickly. The castle was quiet in the early morning hours, the revelry of the previous night having exhausted even the most enthusiastic participants. Alara made her way to the kitchens, where the head cook was already barking orders at the bleary-eyed staff. There was work to be done, always work, and Alara threw herself into it with desperate focus, needing the familiar rhythm of labor to anchor her. "You," the cook snapped, pointing a wooden spoon at Alara. "Take the king's breakfast to his chambers. The usual girl is ill." Alara's stomach dropped. "Matron Grenfell usually assigns, I'm assigning you now. Go." There was no arguing with the cook, a woman whose authority in the kitchen rivaled that of any noble. Alara loaded a tray with bread, cheese, fresh fruit, and a pot of black tea, and made her way through the castle toward the king's private chambers. Her hands trembled slightly, making the dishes rattle, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, to calm the rising panic in her chest. This was fine. This was nothing. She would leave the tray outside the door, knock once, and retreat before anyone saw her. Simple, safe. But when she reached the heavy wooden door of the king's chambers, she found it already ajar. She hesitated, uncertain. Protocol dictated that she knock and wait for permission to enter, but if the door was open, perhaps the king wasn't there. Perhaps she could simply leave the tray on the table just inside and escape. She pushed the door open a little wider and stepped inside. The king's chambers were surprisingly austere for someone of his rank. The furniture was well made, but not ornate. The decorations minimal. A large bed dominated one side of the room, its dark coverings military neat. A desk sat near the window, covered in maps and documents. Weapons hung on the walls, swords, daggers, a longbow, all within easy reach. It was the room of a warrior, not a king, and something about that made Alara's heart twist unexpectedly. She moved quickly to set the tray down on the small table near the fireplace, but as she turned to leave, a voice stopped her cold. "You." Alara spun around, nearly dropping the empty tray. King Alaric stood in the doorway to an adjoining room, his hair damp as if he'd just bathed, wearing only dark trousers and a loose white shirt unlaced at the collar. He looked different like this, less intimidating, more human. But his eyes held the same intensity she remembered from the night before, the same searching quality that made her feel exposed. "Your Majesty," she gasped, immediately dropping into a deep curtsy, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was told to deliver your breakfast. I didn't know you were here." I'll leave immediately. Look at me." It wasn't a request. Ilara's breath hitched, but she obeyed, slowly lifting her eyes to meet his. The moment their gazes connected, she felt it again, that strange pull, like a thread being drawn tight between them. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been surprise or recognition or confusion. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. "Ilara, Your Majesty. Ilara Whitmore." "How long have you worked in the castle, Ilara Whitmore?" 10 years, Your Majesty." He took a step closer, and she forced herself not to retreat. "And in those 10 years, have we ever spoken before?" "No, Your Majesty. But I've seen you before." It wasn't a question. In the corridors, in the Great Hall, always in the background, always working. Ilara didn't know how to respond to that. The idea that the king had noticed her at all, let alone multiple times, seemed impossible. She settled for a simple, "Yes, Your Majesty." Alaric studied her for a long moment, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "Last night?" he said finally. "During the ball. I looked at you, and you looked back. Why didn't you lower your eyes?" The question caught her off guard. The honest answer, that she hadn't been able to, felt too dangerous to voice. Instead, she said, "I apologize, Your Majesty. It was a momentary lapse. It won't happen again. That's not what I asked." Ilara swallowed hard. The conversation had already gone on far too long. Every moment she spent here increased the risk of someone seeing them, of rumors spreading, of the threats she'd overheard becoming reality. "I don't know, Your Majesty," she said, which was as close to the truth as she dared get. It was a mistake. Was it? He took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Tell me something, Ilara. When you look at me, what do you see?" The question was so unexpected, so raw, that for a moment she forgot to be afraid. "I see a man who's tired," she said quietly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "A man who doesn't want to be here, who wishes he could be anywhere else. I see someone who's lonely even when surrounded by hundreds of people." The silence that followed was deafening. Alaric's expression shifted, something cracking in the careful mask he wore, and for just an instant, she saw the vulnerability beneath. Then it was gone, the walls slamming back into place, and his voice turned cold. "You forget yourself, servant. You know nothing about me." "You're right, Your Majesty," Ilara said quickly, curtsying again. "I apologize. I spoke out of turn. It won't happen again." She turned and fled before he could respond, her heart pounding, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the tray. She didn't slow down until she reached the safety of the servants' wing, where she collapsed against the wall and tried to catch her breath. What had she done? She had insulted the king, spoken to him as if he were an equal, revealed thoughts she should have kept buried. He could have her whipped for such insolence, or dismissed, or worse. And yet, even as terror flooded through her, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. For one brief moment, she had seen him, really seen him, and he had seen her in return. It was the most honest interaction she'd had in years, and the memory of it burned bright and dangerous in her chest. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. Ilara waited for the summons that would mean her punishment, but it never came. The castle continued its usual routines. The princesses continued their pursuit of the king, and Ilara continued her work, always watching, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was late afternoon when she was summoned to the Great Hall to help prepare for that evening's banquet. The Mooncrest Ball was a multi-day affair, each night bringing new entertainments and opportunities for the princesses to distinguish themselves. Tonight there would be a feast followed by performances, music, poetry, displays of artistic talent, all designed to showcase the accomplishments of the noble ladies vying for the crown. Ilara worked alongside the other servants, setting tables and arranging flowers, trying to lose herself in the familiar tasks. But she could feel eyes on her, hostile and assessing. When she looked up, she caught several of the princesses watching her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. One of them, a woman with auburn hair and cold blue eyes, leaned over to whisper something to her companion, and both of them laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Alara kept her head down and continued working, but the weight of their attention pressed on her like a physical thing. She was being marked, targeted, and there was nothing she could do about it. That night, as the banquet began, Alara took her position near the back of the hall, ready to serve wine or clear plates as needed. The king entered to great fanfare, taking his place at the head table, and the feast commenced. Course after course was brought out, each more elaborate than the last, and the nobles ate and drank with the enthusiasm of people who had never known scarcity. Alara moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling goblets and removing empty dishes, her movements automatic. She was careful to stay far from the king's table, to avoid even the possibility of another encounter. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One of the princesses, the auburn-haired woman who had laughed at her earlier, called out in a voice loud enough to carry across the hall. "You there, servant girl. Yes, you with the dark hair. Bring me wine. Now." Ilara's heart sank, but she obeyed, approaching the table with a fresh pitcher. The princess held out her goblet with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and as Alara began to pour, the woman shifted suddenly, deliberately, causing the wine to splash across the front of her elaborate gown. "Clumsy fool!" the princess shrieked, leaping to her feet. "Look what you've done! This gown is worth more than your miserable life." The hall fell silent, all eyes turning toward the commotion. Alara stood frozen, the pitcher still in her hands, knowing with absolute certainty that this had been planned, that she'd been set up, and that there was no way out. "I apologize, Your Highness," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was an accident. An accident?" The princess's voice rose to a theatrical pitch. "This was deliberate sabotage. She ruined my gown out of jealousy, out of spite, because she knows she could never be anything more than the worthless servant she is." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Beta Corwin rose from his seat, his thin face twisted with anger. "This is unacceptable," he said coldly. "Such insolence cannot be tolerated. The servant will be punished." "Wait." The single word cut through the rising chaos like a blade. King Alaric stood slowly, his gaze fixed not on the princess, but on Alara. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. "Your Majesty," Corwin began, but Alaric silenced him with a raised hand. "Come here," the king said, and Alara realized with dawning horror that he was speaking to her. She approached on trembling legs, certain she was walking toward her doom. When she reached the king's table, she sank into a deep curtsy and waited for judgment. "Look at me," Alaric commanded, and she obeyed, lifting her eyes to his. What she saw there made no sense. Not anger, but something else. Something that looked almost like concern. "Did you spill wine on Princess Isabeau deliberately?" "No, Your Majesty," Alara said honestly. "It was an accident. She moved as I was pouring." "She's lying," Princess Isabeau protested. "She did it on purpose, I swear it." Alaric's gaze never left Alara's face. "I believe her," he said simply, and the hall erupted. Voices rose in protest and confusion, nobles and princesses alike demanding explanations. Beta Corwin's face had gone white with fury. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, the word of a princess must carry more weight than that of a common servant. The word of a princess who has already demonstrated her dishonesty," Alaric interrupted, his voice hard, "carries no weight at all. I watched what happened. Princess Isabeau moved deliberately to cause the spill. This was a setup, and I will not see an innocent person punished for a crime they didn't commit." The silence that followed was absolute. Ilara couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. The king had defended her. The king had called her innocent. The king had just made an enemy of a powerful noble house for the sake of a servant girl. "This is outrageous!" Princess Isabeau's face had turned crimson with rage and humiliation. "I will not be called a liar by anyone, not even you, Your Majesty." "Then you are free to leave," Alaric said calmly, "as is anyone else who finds my judgment lacking. The door is there." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Princess Isabeau gathered her ruined skirts and swept from the hall, her head held high, several of her ladies-in-waiting following in her wake. The remaining guests remained frozen, shocked into silence by the confrontation they'd just witnessed. Alaric turned his attention back to Alara, who still knelt before him, trembling. "You may go," he said quietly. "And do not worry. You will not be punished for this." Alara managed a shaky, "Thank you, Your Majesty," before fleeing the hall, her mind reeling. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting, the speculation and gossip that would spread through the castle like wildfire. The king had defended a servant against a princess. The king had believed a commoner over nobility. The king had shown favoritism to someone who didn't matter. And Alara, hidden in the shadows of the servants' corridor with her back pressed against the cold stone wall, knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be the same. Everything had just changed, and she had no idea how to survive what came next. The whispers began before dawn. They slithered through the castle like serpents, poisonous and persistent, finding their way into every corridor, every chamber, every whispered conversation between nobles and servants alike. By the time Alara woke, her name was already on 100 tongues, spoken with curiosity, contempt, and calculation. The servant girl, the king's favorite, the commoner who dared. Alara heard the whispers as she made her way to the kitchens that morning, saw the sideways glances from other servants, felt the weight of judgment from people who had been her invisible companions in servitude just yesterday. Some looked at her with envy, others with fear, as if proximity to her might somehow taint them by association. The head cook pointedly assigned her to tasks that would keep her away from the main areas of the castle, scrubbing pots in the back room where no one of importance would see her. But isolation was impossible in a place like Blackridge. News traveled faster than fire, and the story of what had happened in the Great Hall had already been embellished, twisted, transformed into something both more and less than the truth. Some said the king had defended her because she was secretly highborn, a lost princess in disguise. Others claimed she had bewitched him with dark magic, that she was a sorceress who had ensnared the Alpha King with forbidden spells. The more salacious rumors suggested she was already his mistress, that their affair had been going on in secret for months. Alara wanted to scream that none of it was true, that she was just a maid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that she wanted nothing to do with any of this. But screaming would only make things worse. So she kept her head down and her mouth shut and prayed that the storm would pass. It didn't. By midday, Matron Grenfell summoned her to the steward's office, a small, austere room that smelled of old parchment and disappointment. The matron stood beside Beta Corwin, whose pale eyes regarded Alara with barely concealed loathing. Alara's stomach turned to lead. "Alara Whitmore," Corwin said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your behavior last night was highly irregular. While His Majesty saw fit to excuse your clumsiness, there remains the matter of propriety and station. You have become a distraction, a source of unseemly gossip that threatens the dignity of this court." "I never meant," Alara began, but Corwin cut her off with a sharp gesture. "What you meant is irrelevant. What matters is perception, and right now, the court perceives you as someone who has overstepped her bounds. Accordingly, your duties will be reassigned. You will no longer serve in the Great Hall or in any area where you might encounter His Majesty or the noble guests. You will work in the laundry, in the stables, in the lower kitchens, anywhere that keeps you out of sight and out of mind. Is that understood?" Alara nodded mutely, relief and humiliation warring in her chest. She should have been grateful. This was survival, a chance to disappear back into obscurity where she belonged. But something bitter and rebellious stirred inside her, a small voice that whispered this wasn't fair, that she had done nothing wrong, that she shouldn't have to hide simply because a man had looked at her. She crushed that voice ruthlessly. Fairness was a luxury she couldn't afford. "One more thing," Corwin added, his thin lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Should His Majesty ask for you, and I doubt he will, once the novelty of his misplaced chivalry wears off, you are to make yourself unavailable. Claim illness, claim urgent duties, claim anything. But you will not speak to the king again. Are we clear?" "Yes, Beta Corwin," Alara said quietly, hating how small her voice sounded. "Good. Dismissed." Or she fled the office and spent the rest of the day in the laundry, scrubbing sheets in water so hot it scalded her hands, the steam rising around her like fog. The work was brutal, mindless, and exactly what she needed. As long as she kept her hands busy, she didn't have to think about gray eyes and quiet questions, about the king's voice when he'd said her name, about the strange pull she'd felt standing in his chambers. But night came eventually, as it always did, and with it came dreams she couldn't control. She dreamed of the king standing in moonlight, reaching for her with hands that promised safety and danger in equal measure. She dreamed of running through endless corridors while voices laughed and whispered behind her. She dreamed of falling, and waking just before she hit the ground. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears she didn't remember shedding. The next 3 days passed in a haze of exhausting labor and careful avoidance. Alara kept to the lower levels of the castle, worked until her body ached, and spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. She heard rumors that the Mooncrest Ball was continuing, that the princesses were still vying for the king's attention, that several more noble families had arrived to throw their daughters into the competition. She heard that King Alaric had danced with a dozen more princesses, that he had shown favor to none of them, that his mood had grown increasingly dark and volatile. She told herself it had nothing to do with her. She told herself she was insignificant, forgettable, already forgotten. She almost believed it. On the 4th night, as Alara was carrying a basket of clean linens through the servants' corridor, she heard footsteps behind her, measured, purposeful, too heavy to belong to another maid. She turned and found herself face to face with a man she didn't recognize, though his fine clothing and confident bearing marked him as someone important. He was perhaps 40 years old, with sharp features and calculating eyes that assessed her with uncomfortable intensity. "Alara Whitmore?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes, my lord," she said cautiously, setting down the basket and curtsying. "My name is Lord Cedric Ashford, advisor to House Montclair. I've been looking for you. I have a proposition." Every instinct Alara possessed screamed danger. "I'm sorry, my lord, but I'm very busy. Perhaps you could speak with Matron Grenfell if you require something." "What I require is a private conversation with you," Ashford interrupted smoothly. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Alara's mouth went dry, but she followed as he led her down the corridor and into a small, unused storage room lit by a single torch. He closed the door behind them, and the space suddenly felt very small and very dark. "I'll be direct," Ashford said, leaning against a shelf stacked with old tapestries. "King Alaric's behavior these past few days has been noted by many, myself included. His distraction, his disinterest in the princesses, his unprecedented defense of a servant girl. You. People are talking, Alara. And when people talk, opportunities arise." "I don't understand, my lord." "Don't you?" Ashford's smile was cold. "The king is clearly fascinated by you. Whether it's genuine affection or merely novelty doesn't matter. What matters is that you have his attention, which means you have power. Power that could be very valuable to the right people." Alara's blood ran cold. "I have no power, my lord. I'm just a maid. The king barely knows I exist." "Liar," Ashford said pleasantly. "But I'll let that pass. Here's my offer. Align yourself with House Montclair. Feed us information about the king's moods, his opinions, his private thoughts. Use whatever influence you have to steer him toward decisions favorable to our interests. In return, we'll protect you from the enemies you've surely made. Provide you with gold enough to leave this life of servitude behind. Set you up somewhere comfortable where you can live as a lady rather than a slave." "You want me to spy on the king?" Alara said flatly, her voice shaking with anger and fear in equal measure. "You want me to betray him. I want you to be practical," Ashford corrected. "The king is a grown man perfectly capable of handling himself. All we're asking for is information. Small things, harmless things. And in exchange, you get everything you've never had. Security, wealth, freedom. Think about it, Alara. When was the last time you had a choice about anything in your life? I'm offering you one now. For a moment, just one moment, Alara was tempted. The vision he painted was seductive. A life where she didn't have to scrub floors or bow to people who looked through her like she was glass. A life where she mattered, where she had enough to eat, and clothes that weren't threadbare, and a room with a real bed. It would be so easy to say yes, to take the offer, to finally put herself first. But then she thought of the king's eyes, of the way he'd looked at her with something that might have been hope, of how he'd defended her when he had no reason to, and she knew she couldn't do it. Whatever else Alaric Thorne was, he didn't deserve to be betrayed by someone he'd shown kindness to. "No," she said firmly. "I won't do it. I'm sorry, my lord, but you'll have to find someone else." Ashford's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "That's disappointing. I was hoping you'd be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. I'm refusing to commit treason." "Treason is such an ugly word." Ashford pushed off from the shelf and took a step toward her. "Let me make something very clear, Alara. I came to you with an offer out of courtesy because I thought you might appreciate the opportunity. But make no mistake, House Montclair will get what it wants one way or another. If you won't cooperate willingly, we have other methods of persuasion." "Are you threatening me, my lord?" "I'm educating you. The world you've stumbled into is far more dangerous than you realize. Princesses, nobles, ancient houses, they all want the king's favor, and they'll crush anyone who gets in their way. You're an obstacle now, Alara, a problem to be solved. Align with us, and we'll protect you. Refuse, and you'll face the wolves alone. And believe me, the wolves are hungry." Before Alara could respond, the door burst open and torchlight flooded the room. A guard stood in the doorway, his hand on his sword hilt, his expression stern. "Lord Ashford," he said coldly, "you're wanted in the council chamber immediately. And you," he turned to Alara, "have been summoned by His Majesty. Come with me, now." Relief and terror flooded through Alara in equal measure. She hurried out of the storage room, grateful to escape Ashford's presence, but deeply afraid of what awaited her. The king had summoned her. Despite Corwin's orders, despite her attempts to disappear, she was being pulled back into the light. The guard led her through the castle in silence, taking routes she didn't recognize, until they arrived at a part of the fortress she'd never seen before. A tower that rose high above the main structure, its spiral stairs winding upward into darkness. They climbed for what felt like an eternity, Alara's legs burning with effort, until they reached a heavy wooden door at the very top. The guard knocked once, then pushed the door open and gestured for her to enter. Alara stepped through, and the door closed behind her with a finality that made her stomach drop. The room was circular, its walls lined with books and maps, a large window offering a breathtaking view of the realm below. The moon hung low in the sky, full and impossibly bright, bathing everything in silver light. And standing at the window, his back to her, was King Alaric. "You've been avoiding me," he said without turning around, his voice quiet but not angry. Alara's throat tightened. "I was told to stay away from you, Your Majesty. Beta Corwin's orders." "Corwin doesn't give you orders. I do." Alaric turned to face her, and in the moonlight he looked different. Younger, more vulnerable, the lines of stress and duty smoothed away. "I asked for you 3 times. 3 times they told me you were ill or busy or unavailable. I knew they were lying. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, I didn't mean to cause trouble, I was just trying to stay out of the way." "Why?" The question was sharp, almost desperate. "Why are you hiding from me?" "Because I don't belong here," Alara said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Because every moment I spend near you puts me in danger. Because the princesses hate me, the nobles want to use me, and your advisors want me gone. Because I'm nobody, Your Majesty, and you're the king, and whatever this is," she gestured helplessly between them, "it can't exist. It shouldn't exist." Alaric crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, stopping close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and intense. "You're not nobody. I've lived in this castle my entire life, surrounded by hundreds of people, and I've never felt more alone. Until I saw you. Your Majesty." "Alaric," he interrupted. "When we're alone, call me Alaric." I can't do that. It's not proper. You're the king? I know what I am, he said, frustration bleeding into his voice. Every day of my life I'm reminded of what I am. The Alpha King, the ruler of Valenmore, the man who must choose a bride from among 100 strangers who see me as a prize to be won. I'm so tired of it, Alara. Tired of the games, the politics, the false smiles and empty words. And then I saw you, and you looked at me like I was just a man. Not a king, not an alpha, just a man. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Alara's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. That doesn't change anything. It doesn't change who I am or what I am. I clean floors, I wash dishes. I'm not educated or refined or beautiful. I have nothing to offer you. You're wrong about that too. Alaric reached out slowly, as if afraid she might bolt, and gently touched her hand. The contact sent a shock through her entire body, a warmth that spread from her fingertips to her chest. You offered me honesty when you said I looked tired and lonely. You offered me truth when everyone else offers pretty lies. That's worth more than all the jewels and titles in the realm. The court will never accept me, Alara whispered, even as her fingers unconsciously curled around his. They'll destroy me, or use me, or both. I've already been threatened, propositioned, warned to stay away from you. This can only end badly. Not if I protect you. You can't protect me from everything. You're the king, but you're not invincible. And even if you were, is this really what you want? To bind yourself to someone the realm will see as beneath you? To fight your own council, your own people, for a servant girl? Alaric's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would agree, would realize the impossibility of what he was suggesting and send her away. But then he said, I've spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, following tradition, honoring duty, putting the realm before everything else, and I've been miserable. Maybe that makes me selfish. Maybe it makes me foolish. But I don't care anymore. I want... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I want to choose something for myself, just once. And I choose you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and impossibility. Alara wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself fall into the fantasy he was painting. But she'd learned long ago that wanting something didn't make it real. Your Majesty, Alaric, she corrected at his sharp look. You don't know me. This feeling, this connection, it could just be novelty, rebellion against the expectations placed on you. Give it time, and it will fade. It has to. Why? Because you're not a princess? Alaric's voice was hard now, angry. Because you weren't born in a castle? Those things don't define worth, Alara. They're accidents of birth, nothing more. Maybe in a perfect world, Alara said sadly. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in one where birth and blood and status matter more than anything else. And in that world, I'm nothing, and you're everything. And there's no bridge that can span that distance. Then we'll build one. You're not listening to me. No, you're not listening to me. Alaric's hands moved to frame her face, gentle but insistent, forcing her to meet his eyes. I am the Alpha King. My word is law in this realm. If I say you matter, you matter. If I say you belong here, you belong. And if I say that I want you by my side, then nothing, not the council, not the nobles, not tradition or protocol or anything else, will stop me from making it so. Why? Alara asked desperately, tears finally spilling over. Why me? What did I do to deserve this attention, this danger, this impossible situation? You existed, Alaric said simply. You looked at me with kindness and honesty in a place where those things are rare as diamonds. You made me feel human again. That's all. That's everything. They stood there in the moonlight, the king and the servant, separated by everything the world said mattered and connected by something neither of them fully understood. Alara knew she should pull away, should run from this room and this man and this impossible dream before it destroyed her. But she couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare into his eyes and wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe worth wasn't measured in blood and gold. Maybe it was measured in truth and courage and the rare, precious moments when two people saw each other clearly and chose connection over safety. Maybe the moment shattered as the door burst open and Beta Corwin strode in, his face livid with rage. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "This is highly inappropriate. The servants are talking, the nobles are scandalized, and the princesses are threatening to leave en masse if you continue this disgraceful behavior. I must insist that you send this girl away immediately and focus on the task at hand, choosing a proper queen from among the candidates assembled for that purpose." Alaric's hands dropped from Alara's face, but he didn't step back. Instead, he turned to face his advisor, his expression colder than Alara had ever seen it. "Get out, Corwin. Your Majesty, I cannot in good conscience. Get out." The command was absolute, laced with the power of the Alpha, and even Corwin, with all his arrogance, couldn't withstand it. He retreated, but the look he shot Alara promised retribution. When they were alone again, Alaric turned back to her. "I meant what I said, every word, but the choice has to be yours, Alara. I can't force you to accept this, to accept me. So I'm asking, will you stay? Will you let me try to build that bridge?" Alara looked at him, at the hope and fear warring in his expression, and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent her entire life being invisible, being safe, being small. Maybe it was time to be brave instead. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll stay." And with that single word, everything changed. The decision to stay proved easier to make than to live with. In the cold light of dawn, as Alara made her way back to the servants' quarters with the king's promise still echoing in her ears, the reality of what she'd agreed to settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had chosen to walk into the storm rather than hide from it, and now there would be no turning back. The other servants knew before she even reached her room. She could see it in their faces, in the way they stopped talking when she passed, in the mixture of awe and hostility that followed her through the corridors. By the time she arrived at her small chamber, her 3 roommates had already packed her meager belongings and left them in a pile on her mattress. "Matron's orders," one of them said without meeting her eyes. "You're to move to the guest wing, separate quarters. She said someone of your new position shouldn't be sleeping with the common staff anymore." The words were delivered without inflection, but the contempt was clear. Alara wanted to explain that she hadn't asked for any of this, that she was still the same person she'd been yesterday, but the closed expressions on their faces told her it would be pointless. To them, she had become something other, someone who had risen above her station through means they didn't understand and couldn't forgive. She gathered her things in silence and left, feeling the weight of their stares like knives between her shoulder blades. The room she was given was in a part of the castle she'd only ever entered to clean. It was small by noble standards, but palatial compared to what she was used to. A real bed with thick blankets, a wardrobe, a wash basin with clean water, a window that looked out over the castle gardens. There was even a chair, an actual chair with cushions, and a small table with a lamp. For a moment, standing in the doorway, Alara couldn't move. This couldn't be hers. People like her didn't have rooms like this. But the door closed behind her with a soft click, and she was alone with more space and comfort than she'd known in her entire life. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking, and tried to process the enormity of what was happening. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find a girl of perhaps 16 standing in the corridor, her arms laden with fabric. The girl curtsied awkwardly, clearly unsure of the proper protocol. "Begging your pardon, miss, but the king sent these, said you were to have proper clothes." She thrust the bundle at Alara and fled before any response could be given. Alara spread the garments across the bed with trembling hands. There were 3 dresses, each one more beautiful than anything she'd ever touched. They weren't the elaborate gowns the princesses wore, dripping with jewels and embroidery, but they were well made from fine fabrics in deep, rich colors: forest green, midnight blue, burgundy red. There were also underthings, stockings, a warm cloak, and soft leather shoes that would actually fit her feet properly. She ran her fingers over the green dress, feeling the quality of the weaving, and something inside her cracked. This was real. this was happening. The king hadn't forgotten his promise. He was claiming her publicly, dressing her in clothes that announced she was no longer a servant, even if no one knew quite what she was instead. The thought terrified her. She changed out of her servant's gray into the green dress, fumbling with laces and ties that were different from the simple garments she was used to. When she finally managed to fasten everything correctly, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and barely recognized her own reflection. The dress transformed her, lending grace to her thin frame, bringing color to her pale cheeks. She looked almost like she belonged in this room, in this life. Almost. Another knock, more insistent this time. Alara opened the door to find Matron Grenfell standing in the corridor, her expression carved from ice. "His Majesty has requested your presence at breakfast," the matron said, her voice clipped and professional, though her eyes burned with resentment. "You are to join him in his private dining chamber. I will show you the way." The walk through the castle was excruciating. Servants and nobles alike stopped to stare as Alara passed, their whispers following her like a chorus of ghosts. She kept her head high through sheer force of will, though inside she was screaming. This was a mistake. She didn't belong here. Everyone knew it, and soon the king would realize it too. The private dining chamber was a small, intimate space warmed by a crackling fire. A table set for two stood near the window, laden with more food than Alara typically saw in a week. Fresh bread, butter, honey, cheese, sliced fruit, eggs prepared in ways she couldn't identify. And sitting at the table, already dressed for the day in black and silver, was Alaric. He stood when she entered, a smile crossing his face that made him look years younger. "Alara, the dress suits you." "Your Majesty," she began, but he shook his head. "Alaric, remember?" She glanced at Matron Grenfell, who stood stiffly by the door, her lips pressed into a thin line. "There are others present, Your Majesty. It wouldn't be proper." "Then they can leave." Alaric's gaze shifted to the matron. "You're dismissed. Close the door on your way out." For a moment, Grenfell looked as though she might argue, but the authority in the king's voice left no room for debate. She curtsied stiffly and departed, the door clicking shut with ominous finality. "You're making enemies for me," Alara said quietly, moving toward the table but not sitting. "Every favor you show me, every time you choose me over protocol, you create another person who wants me gone. Let them want." Alaric pulled out a chair for her, a gesture so unexpected that she stood frozen for a moment before sitting. "I'm tired of living my life according to other people's expectations. Sit. Eat. You're too thin." The command was gentle but firm, and Alara found herself obeying more out of shock than anything else. She'd never shared a meal with anyone above her station, let alone the king himself. The food smelled incredible, but her stomach was tied in knots too tight to allow for appetite. Alaric sat across from her, his expression softening. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you're afraid. But you need to eat. You need to keep your strength up, because the coming days won't be easy." "What happens now?" Alara asked, forcing herself to take a piece of bread and spread butter on it, if only to have something to do with her hands. "The Mooncrest Ball is still happening. The princesses are still here. What am I supposed to be while all of this plays out?" "You're supposed to be yourself," Alaric said simply. "I'm not asking you to become someone you're not. I'm asking you to stay by my side and let me handle the politics." "And what will you tell them? The council, the nobles, the princesses? They'll demand an explanation." "I'll tell them the truth." Alaric leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "That I've found the woman I want as my queen, and that her birth doesn't matter to me. That I'm invoking the old law." Alara nearly choked on the bread. "The old law? But that hasn't been used in centuries. Most people don't even believe it's real." "It's real. It's part of the original foundation of the wolf clans. The right of an alpha king to choose his mate by bond rather than by political alliance. My ancestors wrote it into law specifically to prevent the crown from becoming nothing more than a bargaining chip between houses. It gives me absolute authority to choose whoever I want, regardless of their status. Even if invoking it causes a civil war?" Alara asked, her voice rising despite her attempt to stay calm. "Because that's what you're risking. The noble houses have been positioning their daughters for this opportunity for years. If you reject all of them for a servant, they won't just accept it. They'll fight back. Then they'll fight." Alaric's jaw set in a stubborn line she was beginning to recognize. "I won't be bullied into marrying someone I don't want. I won't spend the rest of my life chained to a stranger chosen by committee. And I won't let you be driven away by threats and intimidation." The conviction in his voice should have been reassuring, but all Alara felt was dread. He was so certain, so confident in his power and his right to make this choice. But he was also sheltered in ways he didn't seem to realize, protected by his title and his strength from the subtle cruelties that people like her faced every day. He could declare his intentions and invoke ancient laws, but he couldn't control how the court would respond, how the servants would treat her when he wasn't looking, how the princesses and their families would exact revenge for their humiliation. "I believe you mean every word you're saying," Alara said carefully. "But I need you to understand something. I've lived my entire life invisible, beneath notice, safe because I didn't matter enough to hurt. Now you're putting me in the center of the court's attention, making me a symbol of everything the nobility despises, the idea that blood and birth don't determine worth. They will come after me, Alaric, not with swords or open violence, but with whispers and manipulation and schemes I won't see coming. And eventually, they'll find a way to remove me, and you won't be able to stop it. You underestimate me." "No," Alara said softly. "I understand you better than you think. You're powerful and brave, and you genuinely believe that doing the right thing will be enough. But power has limits, and bravery doesn't protect against poison in your cup, or a knife in the dark, or accusations you can't disprove. I'm not afraid for myself, Alaric. I'm afraid for what loving me will cost you." The word hung between them. Love. She hadn't meant to say it, but now it was out there, raw and exposed. Alaric's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering across his face. "Is that what this is?" he asked quietly. "Love?" Alara looked down at her hands, at the dress that marked her as something more than a servant, but less than a lady, at the impossible situation she'd walked into with her eyes open. "I don't know," she admitted. "All I know is that when I'm near you, I feel less alone than I've ever felt in my life, and that terrifies me more than any threat from the court." Alaric reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. "Then we'll be terrified together, but we'll face it together too. I meant what I said last night, Alara. Every word. I'm not going to abandon you when things get difficult. I'm not going to let them destroy you. We'll find a way through this." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But 24 years of survival instincts screamed that this was a fantasy, a beautiful dream that would shatter the moment reality reasserted itself. Still, she didn't pull her hand away. She let herself hold on to this moment, this connection, this impossible hope for just a little longer. The peace lasted exactly as long as it took for Beta Corwin to force his way into the room without knocking, his pale face flushed with anger. "Your Majesty, we have a crisis. The delegation from House Ravencrest has issued an ultimatum. Either you agree to seriously consider Princess Vivian as a candidate for Queen, or they're withdrawing their military support and closing their borders. 3 other houses have sent similar messages. The court is in chaos. This cannot continue." Alaric's hand tightened on Alara's before he released it and stood, his expression hardening back into the mask of the king. "Tell the delegations that I will address the court this evening. Until then, they can wait. Your Majesty, with all due respect, that wasn't a request, Corwin. It was an order. You're dismissed." The Beta's gaze slid to Alara, cold and calculating. This is her fault. Everything that's happening, all the instability and unrest, it's because you've let a servant girl cloud your judgment. If you truly care about this realm, you'll end this madness before it destroys everything your father built. "Careful, Corwin," Alaric said softly, but there was steel beneath the quiet words. "You're dangerously close to insubordination. I suggest you remember your place." For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Then Corwin bowed stiffly and retreated, but not before shooting Alara a look that promised retribution. When they were alone again, Alaric turned to her with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "He's not wrong, though," Alara said, standing and moving toward the window to put distance between them. "I am causing chaos. Your realm is fracturing because of me. Maybe we should—" "Don't." Alaric crossed to her, spinning her around to face him. "Don't let them make you doubt yourself. Don't let them convince you that you're the problem when the real problem is a system that values blood over character, that treats people as commodities to be traded. I won't sacrifice you to preserve that system. I won't. Even if it means losing everything? I've already lost everything that matters if I lose you." The words struck her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and her resistance in equal measure. She looked up at him, at the fierce determination in his eyes, and felt something inside her shift and settle. He meant it. Despite everything, despite the costs and the risks and the impossibility of it all, he meant every word. "All right," she whispered. "Then we fight. Together." The smile that crossed his face was worth every danger that lay ahead. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Alaric had to attend council meetings and strategy sessions, navigating the political minefield his declaration had created. Alara was left to explore her new quarters and adjust to her strange new status. No longer a servant, but not yet anything else. She felt unmoored, caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. In the afternoon, a trio of ladies-in-waiting appeared at her door, sent by the king to help her prepare for the evening's court session. They were polite but distant, their expressions carefully neutral as they helped her dress in the burgundy gown, arranged her hair in an elegant style, and even applied subtle cosmetics that enhanced her features without making her look garish. When they finished, Alara barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked like a lady, like someone who might actually belong in a castle, but the scared girl underneath remained unchanged, terrified of what the evening would bring. The Great Hall had been transformed for the court session. Every noble house and visiting delegation assembled to hear the king's response to the crisis. The princesses sat together in a block, their beautiful faces arranged in expressions ranging from boredom to outrage. The council occupied positions of prominence near the throne, and everywhere Alara looked, she saw hostile eyes and calculating expressions. She entered from a side door as instructed, and the hall fell silent. Every eye turned toward her, assessing and judging. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like prey walking into a den of predators. But then she saw Alaric standing beside his throne, watching her with an expression that held only warmth and encouragement, and she found the strength to cross the floor without stumbling. A chair had been placed beside the throne, not as grand as the king's seat, but positioned in a way that made its meaning clear. Alara was being presented as someone important, someone worthy of sitting beside the Alpha King. The implication sent ripples of shock through the assembled nobles. Alaric took her hand and guided her to the chair, his touch gentle, but his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Thank you all for gathering on such short notice. I know there has been much speculation and concern regarding my intentions for the Mooncrest Ball and the selection of a queen. Tonight, I will clarify my position once and for all." He released Alara's hand and stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. For generations, the Mooncrest Ball has been a tradition meant to unite the great houses through marriage, to forge political alliances and strengthen the realm. It is a tradition I have honored by hosting this gathering and giving every princess present the consideration they deserve. But it is also a tradition that has limitations that I am no longer willing to accept. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Beta Corwin's expression was thunderous. "The old law," Alaric continued, his voice ringing with authority, "grants the Alpha King the right to choose his mate by bond rather than by politics. This law was written by my ancestors who understood that strength comes not from forced alliances but from genuine connection, from loyalty freely given rather than bought with promises of power. Tonight, I invoke that law. I claim my right to choose." The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted objections. Princesses wept or raged. Council members called for order. Through it all, Alaric stood unmoved, his gaze never leaving Alara's face. "I choose Alara Whitmore," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Not because of her birth or her station, but because she is honest and brave and sees me as more than a crown. She is the woman I want by my side, and I will invoke every law and right at my disposal to make it so. Those who cannot accept this decision are free to leave, but know that if you choose opposition over acceptance, you choose exile over belonging in my court." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with shock and disbelief. And then, slowly, one by one, the nobles began to react. Some storming out in fury, others exchanging worried glances, a few nodding in grudging acceptance. But all Alara could focus on was Alaric, standing before his entire court, risking everything for her. And despite the chaos swirling around them, despite the battles she knew were still to come, she felt something bloom in her chest that might have been hope, or might have been love. The aftermath of Alaric's declaration was swift and brutal. By dawn the next day, 7 noble houses had withdrawn their delegations from Blackridge Castle, their carriages thundering through the gates in a display of wounded pride and political fury. The princesses they left behind were fewer in number, but more dangerous. Those who remained had chosen to stay not out of acceptance, but out of strategy, waiting for the opportunity to strike. Alara understood this instinctively. She had lived too long in the shadows not to recognize predators circling wounded prey, and she was wounded, no matter how fine her dress or how close her chair sat to the throne. She was vulnerable in ways that Alaric, for all his power, couldn't fully comprehend. The attempts began small, almost petty. A servant, accidentally, spilled scalding tea on Alara's hand during breakfast, leaving burns that took days to heal. Her dresses were found torn or stained with substances that wouldn't wash out. Food sent to her chamber arrived cold or spoiled, though when Alaric investigated, the kitchen staff swore they'd prepared everything properly. The incidents were calculated to humiliate without leaving evidence, to remind her that she was an intruder in a world that didn't want her. Alara bore it all in silence, refusing to complain to Alaric about the small cruelties. He had enough to manage without adding her troubles to his burden. The council met daily now, debating everything from succession laws to trade agreements, using any excuse to challenge the king's authority. Beta Corwin led the opposition with cold efficiency, never quite crossing into open rebellion, but making his disapproval clear in every word and gesture. "The realm is destabilizing," Corwin argued during one particularly heated council session that Alara witnessed from her position beside the throne. "Border clans are threatening to break away. Trade routes are being closed. Our allies are questioning your judgment, Your Majesty, all because you've chosen to elevate a commoner over qualified candidates who could have strengthened our position. The realm is destabilizing because people like you refuse to accept that worth isn't determined by birth," Alaric countered, his voice hard. "The old law is clear. My choice is valid and binding. If our so-called allies cannot respect that, then they were never truly allies to begin with. And when House Ravencrest marches on our borders, when House Montclair withholds grain shipments, when your own wolf clans question whether you're fit to lead," Corwin's pale eyes were cold as winter. "Will you tell them that love conquers all? Will that feed your people or defend your territory?" The words hit their mark. Alaric's jaw tightened, and Alara felt his frustration like a physical presence in the room. He was trapped between his principles and his responsibilities, between what his heart wanted and what his crown demanded. That night, alone in her chambers, Alara stood at the window and watched the moon rise over the castle walls. The silver light painted everything in shades of gray, beautiful and cold. She thought about the servant girl she'd been just weeks ago, invisible and safe in her insignificance. That girl had known her place in the world, had understood the rules and followed them without question. This new version of herself, neither servant nor noble, claimed by a king but rejected by his realm, existed in a liminal space that felt increasingly unsustainable. A knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Alaric standing in the corridor, his face drawn with exhaustion. He entered without waiting for invitation and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperation that spoke volumes about his day. "Tell me this is worth it," he said quietly, his face buried in her hair. "Tell me I'm not destroying everything for something that can't survive." Alara's heart broke at the doubt in his voice. "I don't know," she admitted, because lying to him had never been an option. "I want to believe it is. I want to believe that what we have is stronger than politics and tradition. But I'm afraid, Alaric. I'm afraid that no matter how hard we fight, the weight of the world will crush us eventually. Then we fight harder." He pulled back to look at her, his gray eyes fierce despite the fatigue. "I won't give up on this, on us. They can threaten and scheme and withdraw their support, but I won't let them win." "What if winning means losing the realm?" Alara asked softly. "What if the price of keeping me is watching everything you've worked for crumble? Could you live with that?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to acknowledge. Alaric opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the door burst open and a guard rushed in, his face pale with urgency. "Your Majesty, there's been an incident. You need to come immediately." They hurried through the castle following the guard, Alara's heart pounding with dread. The guard led them to the courtyard where a crowd had gathered, torches casting flickering shadows across stone and faces. At the center of the crowd lay a body, one of the serving girls who had been friendly to Alara in the early days, before everything changed. "What happened?" Alaric demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "She fell from the eastern tower," a guard reported, his expression grim. "Or was pushed. We found this near the body." He held up a scrap of fabric, the same deep green as the dress Alaric had given Alara. The implication was clear and devastating. Someone was trying to frame Alara for murder, to make it look like she'd killed the girl either out of jealousy or cruelty or simple madness. The crowd's eyes turned toward her, accusing and hostile, and Alara felt the trap closing around her like iron jaws. "This is ridiculous," Alaric said firmly. "Alara has been with me all evening. There's no possible way she could have done this. Unless she hired someone to do it for her." Beta Corwin's voice rang out from the crowd. He stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes gleaming with triumph. "The common staff has reported that this girl was friendly with Miss Whitmore in the past. Perhaps she knew too much about Miss Whitmore's true nature. Perhaps she had to be silenced." "That's a lie," Alara said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "I would never hurt anyone. I didn't do this." "Of course you'd say that," a voice called from the crowd. One of the princesses, Alara couldn't see which. "But servants kill each other all the time over petty jealousies. You may wear fine dresses now, but you can't hide what you really are." The crowd murmured agreement, the mood turning ugly. Alara felt herself being judged and condemned by people who had decided her guilt before even hearing evidence. This was the trap she'd feared, the inevitable consequence of stepping outside her designated place. They were going to destroy her, and they were going to use this poor girl's death to do it. "Enough!" Alaric's voice cracked like thunder, infused with alpha power that made even the boldest nobles step back. "There will be a proper investigation. Until we know the truth, no accusations will be made, and no judgments passed. Alara will remain under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." He took Alara's hand and led her back into the castle, his grip tight enough to hurt. Once they were alone in a private corridor, he spun to face her, his expression tortured. "This is escalating. They're not just trying to drive you away anymore. They're trying to destroy you completely. We need to be smarter about this. More careful." "Or," Alara said quietly, the words she'd been avoiding finally forcing their way out, "I could leave, disappear before anyone else gets hurt, before they succeed in framing me for something worse." "No," the word was absolute. "I won't let them win by terrorizing you into running. We'll find out who did this, we'll prove your innocence, and we'll make them pay for what they've done." But even as he spoke with such certainty, Alara could see the cracks forming in his confidence. The realm was fracturing around them, and every day brought new challenges, new threats, new reasons to doubt whether their love could survive the forces arrayed against it. The investigation into the servant girl's death yielded nothing conclusive. No witnesses came forward. The scrap of green fabric was examined and found to match Alara's dress, but couldn't be definitively linked to her. The most disturbing discovery was a journal found in the dead girl's room, recently written entries that detailed her growing resentment toward Alara, her belief that Alara had betrayed her fellow servants by accepting the king's favor, her threats to expose secrets that Alara supposedly kept. The entries were obvious forgeries to anyone who looked closely. The handwriting was inconsistent. The timeline didn't match known events. The language was too educated for a girl who'd never been taught to read properly. But they provided just enough ambiguity to keep suspicion alive, to poison the court's opinion against Alara. "They're trying to make it impossible for you to stay," Alaric said one night as they sat in his private study, surrounded by documents and reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. "If they can't prove you guilty, they'll settle for making everyone believe you're guilty. Death by 1,000 cuts, destroying your reputation until even my protection isn't enough to save you. Then maybe I should give them what they want," Alara said tiredly. She was exhausted from weeks of constant stress, of watching her back every moment, of enduring hostile stares and whispered accusations. "I could leave. Go far away where no one knows my name. You could choose one of the princesses, restore peace to the realm, and everyone would be happy except us. I would never be happy without you." Alaric's voice was raw with emotion. "And I refuse to believe that the only way forward is surrender. There has to be another option." The other option came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the servant girl's death, a messenger arrived from the Northern Territories, Wolf Clan lands, where the old traditions still held sway and the Alpha's word was absolute law. The clan elders, having heard of the crisis threatening their king, offered a solution rooted in ancient practice: the moon trial. It was a test that hadn't been used in over 2 centuries, a ritual meant to prove the truth of a bond between an alpha and his chosen mate. The details were complex and steeped in mysticism that made even Alaric hesitate, but the core concept was simple. If the bond between them was genuine, if it was fated rather than merely desired, the moon itself would recognize and bless their union. If the bond was false, if Alara was truly unworthy as the nobles claimed, the ritual would reveal that truth as well. "It's dangerous," Alaric said, as they discussed the proposal in the privacy of his chambers. "The moon trial isn't just ceremonial. It requires both parties to submit to ancient magic, to open themselves completely. There's a reason it hasn't been used in so long. People have died attempting it. But if we succeed," Alara said slowly, understanding dawning, "no one could question our bond. Not the nobles, not the council, not the rival houses. The moon's blessing would supersede all political objections. And if we fail, you die. The magic consumes anyone the moon rejects." Alaric's face was pale with fear. "I can't ask you to take that risk. I won't." "You're not asking. I'm volunteering." Alara took his hands, squeezing tight. "This is the only way forward that doesn't end in war or surrender. If our bond is real, and I believe it is, then the trial will prove it. And if it's not," she swallowed hard, "then maybe everyone is right, and this was never meant to be." "Don't say that." Alaric pulled her close, his voice fierce. "Our bond is real. What I feel for you is the realest thing in my life. But the thought of losing you to some ancient ritual terrifies me more than any battle I've ever fought." "We're losing anyway," Alara said softly. "Slowly, bit by bit, worn down by politics and schemes and the weight of a world that doesn't want us together. At least this way, we fight back. We prove that what we have matters, that love and choice and genuine connection are worth more than blood and tradition. Isn't that what you've been arguing all along?" He had no response to that, because they both knew she was right. The moon trial was dangerous, potentially fatal, but it was also their last real chance to claim the future they wanted without destroying the realm in the process. The preparations took a week. The ritual required specific conditions: a full moon, a sacred grove within the Wolf Territories, the presence of clan elders who still remembered the old ways. Alaric and Alara would travel north with a small contingent of guards, leaving Beta Corwin to manage the castle in their absence. It was a risk, leaving the court to his tender mercies, but there was no alternative. The night before their departure, Alara couldn't sleep. She stood in the gardens beneath the waxing moon, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. A month ago, she'd been nobody, invisible and safe. Now she was about to stake her life on the belief that her connection to a king she barely knew was somehow ordained by fate itself. It should have felt absurd. It should have felt like the worst kind of foolishness. But standing there in the moonlight, feeling the certainty that had grown in her chest over these weeks, Alara knew she was making the right choice. Whatever else was true, her feelings for Alaric were real. The way he made her feel seen and valued, the way she'd learned to read his moods and offer comfort, the way they'd built something genuine in the midst of chaos, that was real. That had to count for something. Second thoughts? Alaric's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him approaching through the garden paths. Thousands of them, she admitted. But I'm still going through with it. We could run instead, he offered, not for the first time. Leave the crown, leave the realm, go somewhere no one knows us and build a simple life. I'd give up everything if it meant keeping you safe. And spend the rest of your life wondering if you made the right choice, regretting the kingdom you abandoned? Alara shook her head. No, you were born to lead, Alaric. Whatever happens tomorrow, I won't be the reason you walk away from that destiny. He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, pouring everything he couldn't say into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said, the words raw and honest. I've never said that to anyone before, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Alara Whitmore, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that our bond is real, no matter what any ritual says. I love you too, she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. I think I have since that first morning in your chambers, when you asked me what I saw when I looked at you. I saw a man who needed someone to be honest with him, and I've been falling ever since. They held each other in the moonlight, two people from different worlds who'd found something precious in the most unlikely circumstances. Tomorrow would bring trials and tests, potential death and certain judgment. But tonight, they had this moment, this truth, this love that had grown despite every obstacle the world placed in their path. The journey north took 3 days. They traveled through territories Alara had never seen, past villages and forests and mountains that reminded her how vast the realm truly was. The wolf clans lived in the northern reaches, in lands that were harsh and beautiful in equal measure. When they finally arrived at the sacred grove, Alara felt the power of the place immediately. Ancient trees that whispered in voices only the wind understood. A clearing where moonlight seemed to pool like liquid silver. The sense of something old and watchful observing their approach. The clan elders were there waiting, 7 men and women whose ages ranged from ancient to merely old. They regarded Alara with expressions that gave nothing away. Not hostility, not welcome, simply assessment. She was being measured by standards she didn't understand, judged by criteria she couldn't begin to guess. Alpha King, the eldest spoke, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so weathered. You invoke the moon trial to prove your bond with this woman. Do you understand what you ask? Do you accept the consequences if the moon finds your bond false? I understand, Alaric said firmly. And I accept. And you, girl? The elder's gaze shifted to Alara, sharp and penetrating. Do you enter this trial willingly? Do you accept that the moon sees all truth, and that you cannot hide who you truly are beneath its light? Alara's throat was dry, but her voice was steady. I enter willingly. I accept. Then let the ritual begin. What followed was unlike anything Alara could have imagined. The elders formed a circle around them in the grove, chanting in a language that predated the modern tongue. Alaric took Alara's hands, and she felt power begin to build in the air, crackling like lightning about to strike. The moon, full and impossibly bright, seemed to descend toward them, its light growing stronger until it was almost blinding. And then the world shifted. Suddenly, Alara wasn't in the grove anymore. She was standing in a vast space that felt both infinite and intimate, surrounded by silvery light. and Alaric was there with her, but also not. She could feel him in ways that went beyond physical presence, could sense his emotions as clearly as her own, could see into his heart with a clarity that should have been impossible. She saw his loneliness, years of it, an ache that had started in childhood when he'd lost his mother and his father had become distant. She saw his fear of failure, the weight of responsibility that had shaped him into someone who rarely showed vulnerability. She saw his doubts about whether he was truly fit to rule, whether he deserved the loyalty his people gave him. And she saw his love for her, raw and overwhelming, a connection that had formed the moment their eyes met across the crowded hall, a recognition of something essential and true that transcended logic or reason. At the same time, she felt him seeing into her, felt him witnessing her pain, the child who'd lost her mother and grown up alone, the young woman who'd learned to survive by making herself invisible, the servant who'd endured years of small cruelties without complaint. He saw her strength and her fear, her kindness and her scars, everything she'd hidden from the world. And he loved all of it. She could feel his love like sunlight on her skin, unconditional and absolute, accepting every part of who she was without judgment or reservation. The moon's voice, or perhaps it was the voice of something older, something primal that the moon represented, spoke directly into their consciousness. You are bound, not by politics or tradition, but by truth, by choice freely made, by souls that recognize their counterpart. The bond is real. The bond is blessed. Light exploded around them, brilliant and all-consuming, and then they were back in the grove, both of them gasping as if they'd been underwater and had just broken the surface. The elders stood watching, their expressions now showing satisfaction, and something that might have been awe. "The moon has spoken," the eldest declared, her voice carrying clearly through the night. "The bond is true. Let no one challenge what the ancient power has blessed." Alara felt different, not in any physical way, but in some fundamental aspect of her being. She was still herself, still the girl who'd scrubbed floors and endured hardship, but she was also more than that now. She was recognized, not just by a king or a court, but by something older and deeper than mortal institutions. She belonged not because someone granted her permission, but because the universe itself had witnessed her truth and found it worthy. Alaric pulled her into his arms, and she felt his relief and joy flooding through the bond between them. A bond that was no longer just emotional, but something more, something permanent and profound that would connect them for the rest of their lives. They returned to Blackridge Castle in triumph. News of the successful moon trial had traveled faster than their horses, carried by messengers who spread word through the realm. By the time they arrived at the castle gates, even the most skeptical nobles had to acknowledge what had happened. The old law had been invoked. The moon trial had been passed. The bond had been blessed by powers that predated the kingdom itself. Beta Corwin met them in the courtyard, his expression carefully blank. "Your Majesty, Miss Whitmore, congratulations on your successful trial. The council awaits your pleasure." The court session that followed was remarkably subdued. The nobles who had opposed Alaric's choice so vehemently now sat in awkward silence, unable to argue against the judgment of the moon itself. A few houses sent formal apologies for their earlier objections. Others simply bowed to the inevitable and began positioning themselves to curry favor with the future queen. Alaric addressed the court with quiet authority, his hand never leaving Alara's. Today marks a new chapter for Valenmore, a chapter where worth is measured by character rather than bloodline, where bonds of genuine connection are honored above political convenience. Alara Whitmore will be my queen, and she will be respected as such. Those who cannot accept this are free to leave my service. Those who remain will be expected to show her the dignity and honor her position deserves. The silence that followed was acceptance, grudging for some, genuine for others, but acceptance nonetheless. The battle wasn't entirely over. There would still be challenges, still be nobles who resented the change, still be schemes and plots from those who refused to adapt. But the war had been won. The right to their bond had been established beyond question. That night, Standing together on the balcony of what would soon be their shared chambers, Alara and Alaric watched the moon rise over the realm they would rule together. "Do you regret it?" Alaric asked softly. "Giving up the simple life you might have had for all of this?" Alara thought about the question seriously, considering the weight of what lay ahead. The responsibilities, the scrutiny, the constant navigation of court politics. Then she thought about what she'd gained. Love, purpose, a partner who saw her truly and chose her anyway. "No," she said simply. "I regret nothing. This won't be easy, but it will be real. And real is all I've ever wanted." Alaric kissed her temple, pulling her close. "Then we'll face it together. The good and the bad, the triumphs and the challenges, together." And as the moon blessed them with its silver light, Alara Whitmore, orphan, servant, chosen maid of the Alpha King, allowed herself to believe in happy endings after all. Not because the story was over, but because it was finally, truly beginning.